Welcome to On the Way, a podcast about life. But not just any life, it's about life with Jesus. Why do people follow Jesus, and how do they get started? And what difference does following Jesus make in their lives? Before Christians had a name, they were known as people of the way, people who followed Jesus' teachings. People have been on the way for nearly 2,000 years now. During the podcast, we explore the ways that people become followers of Jesus and why, and what difference following Jesus makes in their lives. On the Way is produced by the Baptist Standard, a donor-supported provider of news, opinion, and resources for living like Jesus. I'm Eric Black, editor of the Baptist Standard. I'm glad you're with us today. We have with us today David King. He's a retired missionary from North Africa and the Middle East, and we're so glad to have you with us today.
Thank you.
So I see from your bio that you were born in Michigan and grew up in New Jersey, and that you graduated from Howard Payne University, which is in Brownwood, Texas.
Yes.
So one of the things I'm curious about before we get into the focus of the podcast, how did you get to Brownwood, Texas from New Jersey?
Well, I met a Texas girl while I was in the service in Hawaii. We met and married at Olivet Baptist Church in Honolulu, Hawaii, although we both worked at Hickam Field at the time. I was in the Air Force. She was working for the government in civil service. But we met at Olivet Baptist Church and were married there May 12th of 1946, 74 years ago.
Wow.
And so anyway, she was from Texas, and we decided, well, I had been accepted at Wheaton College and she had been accepted at Baylor, but neither one of them had any housing for married couples. So we got in touch with Howard Payne, and they had open apartments for married couples. So we decided to go there, and we're glad we did.
74 years, that is a long time.
Yes.
There's not very many people who can say that.
We are surely blessed.
Yes, yes. So married housing took you to Brownwood.
Yes.
All right. Well, so I want to know how you became a follower of Jesus to begin with. And because that was a long time ago also.
Yes.
Yeah,
indeed.
Okay.
Well, I was about 9 years old, and my father was a part director of a youth camp in New Jersey. And I was at the camp, and there was a lady who had flannel graph stories for children, and she laid out the plan of salvation on the flannel graph board, and at the end invited us to accept Jesus. And I indicated, yes, I would like to do that. And that's when it happened, when I was about 9 years old. So I was baptized when I was 12 on my mother's birthday in the Northfield Baptist Church in Livingston, New Jersey.
All right. I know she was excited about that.
Yes, she was happy.
All right. And I also noticed in your bio that you became a pastor before you graduated from Howard Payne. So that tells me that somewhere in there from between the time that you became a follower of Jesus and when you ended up at Howard Payne, you were making some decisions about what it meant to follow Jesus.
Yes. While I was growing up in Northfield Baptist Church, when I was about 12, 13 years old, one of the older ladies laid her hands on my shoulders and said, "David, someday you're going to be a missionary." Well, I didn't believe it. I had other plans. My dad was a school teacher, and I thought I would be a school teacher. But after I got into the Air Force, I was stationed at Laredo, Texas, and went into the church there on Sunday morning and met a group of young people who were also there, who at one time or another had been to Pine Brook Bible conference in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. 9 of us were there on the border of Mexico, and 2 of them, actually 3 of them, were waiting to go into what they called boot camp in Mexico to get used to the idea of being a missionary. Well, they talked to me about missions and how it was so unfair for us to have all the benefits that we have in the United States, with churches on almost every corner and Bibles available in a 5 and 10 cent store. And we could hear the gospel on the radio any day of the week. And in those other places, they had nothing. And they said to me, if you saw 10 men carrying a log and 9 of them were at the little end, where would you go to help? So obviously the big end was where I needed to go. Well, they said, out there in those other countries where they don't have these advantages, that's where we are planning to go to help, and you might want to consider joining us. So that Sunday afternoon, sitting on the back steps of a house in Laredo, Texas, I felt the Lord say to me, David, this is what I want you to do with your life. So I wrote to my folks and I told them about that. And they said, David, now we can tell you we couldn't before, but we gave you to the Lord to be a missionary before you were born. Hallelujah. God has answered our prayers. And so anyway, that was before Maxine and I met. But when I met Maxine in Honolulu, she also had felt called to the mission field. And so we decided to make a team of it. And after we were married there in Honolulu at the Olivet Baptist Church, and then came back to the States and finally made it to Howard Payne by bus, and finally graduated from there in 1953.
Okay. I want to camp out on something for just a moment, because you said that a woman put her hand on your shoulders and said, you're going to be a missionary. And then you end up in Laredo, and young people who were going into Mexico, that were going to go to like a boot camp for missionaries, talk to you about missions. And then you tell your parents, and they say, we gave you over to the Lord before you were born for missions.
Yes.
That sort of stops me in my tracks.
Well, it's sort of amazing.
Yeah. Wow. And so you graduated from Howard Payne in 1953.
Yes.
But before you graduated, you were already pastoring churches.
Yes. In between our first and second year in college, we took out and did not go to school because our first child was born in 1947. And so while we were out, I helped around the farm where her parents lived as sharecroppers, and went to her home church, which was kind of a country church a few miles away. So during the summer, they were without a pastor, and they asked me if I would preach. And I did. And so the director of missions for the area was the interim pastor at the time. And he sat down with me one day and he said, David, would you consider pastoring this church? And I said, well, I'd never thought about that as a possibility. I thought God wanted me to be a teacher. I had not considered pastoring. And he said, well, if the church calls you, would you consider it? Yes, I would consider it. So they did, and I did. And that was in 1947. And we pastored that country church for 8 years. And then after we graduated from Howard Payne, we went on to Southwestern Seminary, and we drove back to Angus, Texas, south of Corsicana, every Sunday, 4 hours each way. We went on Saturday nights in a Model A Ford, no heat, no air conditioning except 4 windows. And we held meetings on Saturday night and Sunday morning, and Sunday afternoon we drove back to Brownwood, and that's the way we finished our college. Also, that was half-time pastorate, and after we had gone back to Howard Payne, we heard that they needed a pastor half-time at Star, Texas, so we went out there and they called us, and that filled in the other 2 weeks of the month. And so we pastored 2 half-time churches for 2.5 years.
When I was a student at Hardin-Simmons, there were students at Logsdon who would travel maybe an hour or two to preach or to pastor a church. And this was just something that ministry students did at that time. That was in the mid-90s. And when I think about that today, I think how extraordinary it is that people like you would travel for hours to serve a church.
Yes.
And maybe not, you might get paid, you might not get paid, but to serve like that, it's just incredible. What was going on in your relationship with Christ that made you willing to do that?
Well, daily Bible reading and prayer time. I've always felt that was absolutely necessary for any time anyone serves the Lord. That's a necessary foundation. And of course, my wife, same way. She felt the same way. And so we have always had a devotional time every morning.
We're going to take a sponsor break, and we'll be right back.
Since 1952, South Texas Children's Home Ministries has focused on healing hearts and sharing hope. Their 9 ministries focus on helping hurting children and families, all regardless of an individual's ability to pay. To find out more, visit www.stchm.org.
So you graduated from Howard Payne, and it was a couple of years later that you became missionaries.
Yes, a few years later. Okay. We went to seminary, and while I was in seminary, my wife worked in the aircraft industry in Grand Prairie, and we lived in Arlington. We had our child, and we would drive to Grand Prairie and drop her off at work, and then I would drive to Fort Worth and put him in his kindergarten class in Fort Worth, and then go to the seminary in Fort Worth. And in the evening, we reversed the process, so we traveled 50 miles each way, 100 miles a day to get everything done and everywhere where they needed to go. Well, when I graduated in 1956, we didn't know what to do next. Maxine had been laid off at the aircraft plant in Grand Prairie, and she had transferred to an aircraft plant in Fort Worth to consolidate aircraft. But she was having to stand 8 hours a day on a concrete floor and never sit down. And her feet and legs got very tired, even though she only weighed 90 pounds at the time. But still, she looked for something else to do. Well, we saw an advertisement in the paper for somebody to teach at Keller, Texas, north of Fort Worth. And we contacted the superintendent, and he said, please come for an interview. So we drove up to Keller, and she went in to the interview, and I stayed out in the car. And so at the close of the interview, Mr. Simpson said, I understand your husband is a pastor. And she said, yes. And he said, well, we're without a pastor right now. do you think he would consider leading the worship service on Wednesday night? And she said, well, he's out in the car. Let's go ask him. So they came out and asked, and we said, okay, we'll do that. So they especially liked my singing. I used to sing very well. I can't do that anymore. But anyway, we did that on Wednesday night, and then they said, could you fill in for us on Sunday morning? So I said, oh, okay, but not this Sunday. I have to go back to Angus, Maxine's church, and tell them so they can make other arrangements for next Sunday, and then I'll lead the service. So we did that, and then on that Sunday evening, I preached on missions, and I got all fired up. And so after the service was over, the deacon and the head of the pulpit committee said, now you go on out to the car, we're going to talk this over. And I thought they were maybe going to ask me to be minister of music and maybe children's or some other thing to go with it. And after about a half an hour, he came out to the car and he said, Brother David, the church has unanimously called you to be their pastor. And I almost fainted. I didn't expect that at all. So he said, well, what shall I tell the people? I said, well, tell them we'll pray about it and I'll give you an answer on Wednesday. So that's what we did, and we accepted it, and we pastored at Keller for almost 4 years. And that's from there is where we left to go to Lebanon.
Gotcha.
We were appointed in 1959.
We're going to take a 60-second sponsor break, and we'll be right back. High Ground Advisors has a 90-year history of providing investment management and planned giving solutions to churches, faith-based organizations, and charitably minded individuals dedicated to transforming lives. High Ground is trusted by over 450 nonprofit clients, and we're one of them. High Ground has partnered with Baptist Standard for over 70 years by offering a comprehensive charitable giving and investment solutions model, which includes asset management, planned giving education and development, account support services, real estate and minerals management, and expert legal consultation. High Ground and the Baptist Standard share similar values, such as serving those who are called and dedicated to transforming lives and being a trusted caretaker of legacies. They also value good stewardship, helping those who desire to be good stewards of their financial resources to find creative giving solutions to fulfill that calling. They know what they do to protect, strengthen, and grow our mission is ultimately in service to the gospel. To learn more about how High Ground Advisors can partner with you or your organization, visit their website at highgroundadvisors.org. So in 1959, you and Maxine were assigned to Lebanon by the Foreign Mission Board, which is now the International Mission Board for the Southern Baptist Convention.
Yes.
And that was a pretty extraordinary time to go to Lebanon. Of course, it seems like any time is an extraordinary time to go to Lebanon, but for some of our younger listeners...
It was very peaceful the first 15 years. Very peaceful and lovely. We used to go to the Cedars for picnics, about a 3-hour drive from our home in Beirut up into the mountains to the cedar trees. And then there were other places in Lebanon. We could visit the ruins of Sidon and Tyre and Baalbek and other famous ancient Roman ruins around in Lebanon. And it was really a lovely time until the Civil War started in 1975. And in 1975, things really got bad, and for the next 12 years until 1987, we lived in the middle of a civil war. There were about 100,000 people who died violent deaths all around us, but the Lord kept us safe, and we thank Him for that.
Yeah. in the middle of a civil war, you were still called to be a missionary.
Yes, indeed.
That call didn't end just because the Civil War came.
Not at all. And in fact, I was one of the founding members of the faculty of the Arab Baptist Theological Seminary just outside of Beirut. And we lived on the seminary campus. And we were able to keep classes going all through those 12 years, except for 1 year. 1 year, we got down to one student on campus, and nobody else could come or go. So we canceled classes for that 1 year and picked up again the following year. But the sounds of war were very, very frequent. I won't say constant, but on and off all during the school year. But we were able to keep going under the leadership of Dr. Finley Graham, who was the founder of the seminary. And during that time, we went through some pretty interesting experiences. There was a time when mortar bombs were exploding on the seminary campus. And one morning, we were eating breakfast, and we had heard some explosions nearby. And we thought we heard somebody knocking on the door, front door. So we got up and went to see, and Maxine opened the door and looked out, and she said, "Well, I see where that one landed, right out at the yard fence." And just about that time, we heard one coming in, and we just had time to turn our backs, and it exploded in the front yard, and we could feel the hot air right up our backs. As we turned away from it in the doorway. Our two younger children were with us, Jonathan and Jeannie, and they experienced all this along with us. And anyway, that explosion cut down olive branches off the trees all around us. We lived in the middle of an olive orchard, and threw dust and dirt and branches and debris up on the roof of our house, flat top house. But only one little piece broke the glass in the front door and stuck in the curtain inside that window, and nothing else came into the house. That's one of those examples where the Lord saved us. Another time, a shell fell underneath the picture window in our dining room that looked out over the Beirut River Valley. And
in your house?
It fell right next to the house, but did not explode because Maxine had watered the flowers out there the day before, and the ground was muddy, and the shell buried up in the mud but did not explode. But we had to get the local militiamen to come and defuse that thing and take it out. But that same window was blown out by concussion from near falling shells 3 times. We had to replace that picture window. One time, a few years later, shells began falling on the seminary campus again, and the basement door was from the outside. We couldn't get to it from inside the house, but that was the safest place to go. So we ran around the outside of the house to the basement door and went downstairs. And as we went downstairs, another shell exploded and broke the glass in the windows around the basement. And the broken glass fell down the stairs behind us as we were going down into the shelter.
Wow.
But we slept many nights down in that shelter.
It's incredible to think of ministering in circumstances like that. Most of us, as you said earlier, that we're in a country at a time when we don't experience that.
No.
And yet so many places in the world do, and God called you to one of those that at the time you went was peaceful, but it wasn't peaceful forever.
That's right.
how, again, I'm curious, what is it about Jesus that you were so committed to the work that he called you to that you would endure that?
Well, if we believe that God is in control and always in control, no matter what happens, then you can rest in Jesus because he's in control and he allows to happen whatever he allows to happen in progress of accomplishing his will. So there's a verse that says, he that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide or rest in the shadow of the Almighty. And the words of Jesus, come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. We depended on those verses. There were times when the Syrian army was just across the valley from us and could have moved in on us at any time. And we didn't know when that might happen or what we would do if it did. But God kept them on the other side of the valley, and we're thankful for that.
Yeah. So today, this is many years after you retired in 1989.
Yes.
So when you hear of the explosion in Beirut,
Yeah.
and you know what they've experienced in the time between 89 and today, most of us who don't have the kind of connection to Lebanon that you do, we hear it as a tragedy.
Yes.
But we're disconnected from it.
Yeah.
How did you receive that news?
Well, it hurt. I'll tell you, we were there when numerous car bombs exploded, and we know the feeling, we know the devastation, we know the tragedy when lives lost and property destroyed. And we knew exactly how those people felt, and we could feel it again in ourselves. And we have sent a little money to help rebuild and to relieve some of that suffering. But we wish we could be there to help out more, but it's not possible anymore.
Yeah. So we know that people from Lebanon have moved to the United States, and we may encounter them from time to time. Many of them have businesses that we like to frequent, restaurants that, quite frankly, I really enjoy.
Yes, indeed.
So when we interact with someone from Lebanon as Americans or just as followers of Christ in America, what are some things that we should be mindful of?
Number one, be a friend. Be a friend, whatever it takes, be a friend. Be sympathetic. Listen to them. Ask them what their background is and where they came from and what they were doing during the war. Many of them now were born after the war was finished, after 1990, but some of them are from villages that suffered much from that war. And if you ask them and they are willing to share with you, that's a good way to show friendliness. And when you have an opportunity, tell them what Jesus meant to you during the wartime.
Well, I have a final question.
Yes.
For someone who maybe is in a similar position that you were in back in Laredo and has a sense that Jesus is calling them to some kind of mission work.
Yes.
What would you tell them?
Well, if you feel the call of God, let it be known. We had an interesting experience in that regard. At Olivet Baptist Church, before we were married, Maxine and I were going together as friends. And the pastor asked one time, because he knew that she had felt God's call, have you ever made that public? And she said, no. And he said, well, tonight after the service, when the invitation is given, why don't you come down and let the congregation know that you have felt called to the mission field? And so she told me about that on Sunday afternoon. Well, I didn't say anything, but when the invitation came, I was sitting at the end of the pew, and she was inside next to me. And so when it was given, I left and went out first and went down to the aisle, and she was very upset about that. She said, why did you do that? You knew I was going, but why did you go down first? It made it look like I was following you. And I said, well, I sure didn't want you go down first and then me to follow, because then it would look like I was following you. And I wanted people to know this was my decision, and I wanted to make it public just like you do. So anyway, we both did that in the same service. And I think she has forgiven me now.
It was a race to the front. Yeah.
Almost, yes.
Well,
but we've made a team of it.
It sounds like it. 74 years.
Yes.
Yeah. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that your ministry did not end in 1989.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Oh, no. I came back and was interim pastor of a church in New Jersey for 2.5 years until my mother needed to go into a nursing home, and we felt free to come back to Texas. And we came back to Marshall, to the East Texas Baptist University, where I had taught for a year while our younger son was in college for his first year. And so we decided this was a good place to settle. And so when we retired, we came back to Marshall. We've been here ever since. I forgot to say, I have been going out to preach in various places and challenge people with the call to missions. And we've enjoyed it thoroughly. And I have done interim pastorates from time to time. So yes, I have not been out of ministry. It's just been a different kind of ministry.
Yes.
And at ETBU, I was able to teach Bible classes for 5 years, and that was a blessing to me, and I hope for the students, because I was able to give them a Middle Eastern view of the Old Testament especially, and sometimes in the New Testament, Middle Eastern patterns of thinking and so on. That made it interesting.
Well, it's invaluable. I've found it's difficult to really understand Scripture, or much deeper than maybe a surface level in some cases, without having knowledge of the Middle East, Middle Eastern culture,
yes.
Middle Eastern history.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful that you have been on the way with Christ for decades, going back to, 1940s and even before that.
Yes, but especially from 46 on. 46
yes.
is when we accepted the call to Maxine's home church. And that was the beginning of our pastoral experience, and it kept on going from there, and then to the seminary in Beirut, and then back home again, and still serving the Lord as He opened the door.
Well, thank you very much for spending this time with me.
My pleasure.
Just because a person follows Jesus doesn't mean that person is perfect. Following Jesus is a lifetime of growing more like Him. Likewise, while there are followers who are more mature than others, who have spent more time growing close to Jesus than other followers, there are no followers of Jesus who are better than others. If you aren't on the way with Jesus, we invite you to check out the Follow Jesus page on the Baptist Standard website at baptiststandard.com/Follow Jesus to learn more about becoming a follower of Him. If you are on the way with Jesus, we hope that this podcast has encouraged you to grow more like Him. The On the Way podcast is produced by the Baptist Standard, a donor-supported provider of news, opinion, and resources for living like Jesus. To make a donation, visit baptiststandard.com/donate. To receive the Baptist Standard Weekly Newsletter, visit baptiststandard.com and click on the subscribe button. You can help us reach more people with the On the Way podcast by sharing it and by leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Eric Black, editor of the Baptist Standard, and I'm glad you've been with us today.